Okay. So today we are going to be talking about virtue ethics. So just to give everyone an overview of what our plan looks like for today, the first little bit of class, I'm going to be giving an overview on virtue ethics. So just kind of talking about the idea more generally. And then as you'll see, sort of the way that we instantiate that idea can be, there's some variation to it. So unlike the other, or not necessarily unlike, but just there's a little bit more variation really in how we hang together, how different versions of virtue ethics sort of hang together the different moral values. So in the previous ethical theories that we've been looking at, there's been a lot of consistency in the kinds of values that would hang those theories together. And there's just a little bit more variation in virtue ethics. So in light of that, we're going to be talking about a few different versions of virtue ethics. And then at the end of the lecture, we're going to be looking into some challenges for the theory overall, the theory in general. And then at the end of class, or the last thing we're going to be doing in class today, is you're going to be getting into some breakout groups and working on a class activity. Okay, so do I have any questions right off the bat from anyone? No, think that we're good. All right. Okay, great. Well, then let's get started. All right, so we've talked about the ethics of the person when we talked about Kant a couple of weeks ago in particular. And there, the values that sort of hung the theory together were all centering around dignity, and acknowledgement of individual persons. And then last week, we talked about the ethics of happiness. In particular, we talked a lot about utilitarianism, right? Where the center of our web that hung the theory together was all about total net happiness. And then this week, we're going to be looking at the ethics of virtue. And like I mentioned, there's a little bit more variation in how virtue ethics theory hangs itself together, but really at the center of it, there's a focus on a kind of human flourishing. And as we're going to see, it's not necessarily individual flourishing for all. There's one version of virtue ethics where it's more community based. But the basic idea is that there's something about people living up to their full potential, just in light of various aspects of ourselves, our communities, our relationship with nature, and in sort of striving to achieve that full potential, individuals, to some extent, can obtain a good moral character or sort of develop a good moral character. Actually, so before I move on, there were a couple of very specific messages I got in the chat box. And for those people, if you want to just send me an email and talk to me about it after class, I just want to let you know I did see it, but unfortunately I can't type and lecture at the same time. So if you want to just shoot me an email about it, that works. Okay, so in general, or rather like, so in this overview, sort of the most general understanding of virtue ethics that we can get at, these are going to be moral values, the kinds of moral values that we're going to be thinking about today are tied up with our character. Okay. So in the previous theories that we have looked at, so the ethics of person and the ethics of happiness, right? A lot of that was centered around action, like what should I do, right? So can somebody remind me for the ethics of the person? Can somebody give me an example of a kind of like moral rule that a person needs to follow, like a specific direction for action, like something maybe you're not allowed to do?
Like not keeping a promise, like when you make a promise.
Yeah, promise breaking. We were talking about lying also, right? Like that was very centered around, like what is okay to do, right? Like, and what's not okay to do, morally impermissible. Okay. Now can somebody give me like a similar sort of rule, or not necessarily a similar rule, but some kind of rule that came out of the ethics of happiness that we talked about? I'm certain that someone here. Let's see. Shanili, do you remember a moral rule or principle that we were supposed to follow in the ethics of happiness?
It's funny because I was about to raise my hand.
Hmm.
So if I remember correctly, as a society and as individuals with agency, we're supposed to work together for the net value of happiness of society.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, allocating resources that may further or benefit individuals and in turn society as a whole.
Yeah. Increase overall. You do the stuff that increases the net happiness. And like we talked about, the idea of happiness is there's a lot of nuance to that. It's not necessarily just like the straightforward feel good stuff. But still, that kind of theory is one that's focused on asking, what should I do? What kinds of actions are morally permissible, right? The kinds of actions or the kinds of actions that we should do, right? So maybe perhaps like a moral obligation to do these things, take these kinds of actions, are going to be the ones in the ethics of happiness that are going to increase the net happiness, right? Like, for example, if lying ultimately increases overall net happiness and happiness in the good, meaningful sense, right, that we talked about, that's a good thing to do. So both of those theories, what they were sort of aiming to do, the main takeaways that we got from examining those are very much focused on action. All right. And that is going to significantly contrast the ethical theory that we're talking about today, virtue ethics. Within virtue ethics, what you're looking at is not so much what should I do, but what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of character do I want to develop? Okay. And there's still ways to answer a question of like, what should I do? It's not as if there's, within this ethical theory doesn't provide any guidelines for actions. But when we're asking those questions, what we end up when we're saying, like, is this like should I lie to this person to avoid hurting their feelings, for example, instead of looking to a specific moral principle, like, would this increase overall net happiness, or am I respecting that person's dignity if I do that? We're thinking about, okay, what would somebody with a virtuous character do under these circumstances? It's not necessarily about rule following as much as it is about developing this rich moral character within oneself. So just to kind of get the gears turning on the kinds of things that we're the kinds of things that we're talking about. I'll talk about examples in just a minute. Let's see. Kaden, yeah, you had a question.
I'm just curious because right now you said it's not about like being honest and stuff like that. It's about like someone with virtuous character would do. So you lie?
Okay, so I'm so glad that you asked this question, because this is exactly the place where I'm trying to explain how we shift gears in our thinking. So it's not about, I didn't say honesty. I said, under a specific set of circumstances, would it be okay to lie to somebody to avoid hurting their feelings, right? So it's not about necessarily having, like when we say the word honesty, that's something that maybe is tied up within someone's moral character. And when we are thinking about virtue ethics, we're not sort of asking these bigger questions about like what counts as honest behavior. Like the goal is to be like an honest, genuine person in many cases. What we would be sort of the way that we would apply this kind of approach would be just asking, what would a virtuous person do, somebody with a good moral character do under these particular circumstances? And we're not, importantly, going to get answers about what that, whether lying in general is okay. We're only going to be getting answers. And as we're going to actually talk about it in like nearing, or rather a little bit later, one of the sort of, pros and cons of virtue ethics is that we like the decisions that we make. So like in a situation where you're thinking about lying to somebody to avoid hurting their feelings, we'll get maybe answers under specific sets of circumstances, and they apply to like specific people, but we're not going to get an answer about like whether it's okay to lie. Does that clear things up for you, Kaden? Or did you have a follow-up?
No, I get it. So
Okay.
The point is we lie. Okay.
No, it's not.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, I love that. I really want you to like hold on to this, what is going on in your head here, because I feel like this is very much tied up in the kind of pros and cons that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So like hold on to that skepticism there, because I think it's going to be a really important point to bring up again in a little bit. Okay. So, this is great. I feel like everybody is really like, thinking about this in the right way. All right. So, some examples of, virtuous character traits, we might say, justice, right? We talked about this a while ago, right? When we were talking about Meno, one of the first things that we were, temperance. So actually, would anybody like me to explain temperance a little bit? You can say yes or no in the chat box. Okay. Temperance is kind of wonderful. Great. So temperance is kind of like balancing doing the things that like feel good, like nice little treats for yourself, with overindulgence. So finding like that nice middle ground. So I think that probably a lot of people here have used television maybe as a little bit of a thing to relax with. And if you have, you're probably familiar with that feeling of like going over the edge a little bit, like binging too much on a show. Yeah, Victoria, exactly. It's about moderation. So finding like that middle ground, that right amount of TV to watch, say, to like let your brain relax a little bit and chill out, but not going overboard and, you know, like binging on like some Real Housewives for, you know, 8 hours or something like this. It's that middle ground. So other virtuous character traits: courage, in a lot of different ways, having faith, hope, charity, right? Tranquility. These are all, to some extent, virtuous character traits that we're going to be talking about with respect to different theories that we're going to be looking at today, or different versions of virtue ethics that we're going to be looking at today. Non-attachment, compassion, and nonviolence. Right. So actually, Shaneely, I'm really glad that you brought this up. So Shaneely said in the chat box, it sounds like she was worried that she talked about temperance in the wrong way, by describing it in terms of self-restraint. And that's not wrong. There's a lot of different ways to characterize these different virtuous character traits. I think self-restraint totally works for temperance. I'm just sort of speeding through it. And as we're going to see, you know, especially when we think about these character traits, specifically in relation to different versions of virtue ethics, we'll see that like will enrich the meaning of these different words in different ways. So there's a lot of flexibility there. So if I've said anything about any of these just now that conflicts with something that you said on the quiz, seriously, don't worry about it. There's a lot. These are really rich concepts, and there's a lot of different things to say about them. Is there any, so I explained temperance a little bit. Would anybody like me to explain any of the other terms, or based off of the reading and stuff, do you feel comfortable in general with these different terms? Okay, I will continue on in that case. All right, so the next, now that we've talked a little bit just about our general sort of entry point, when we're thinking about virtue ethics, and we're in particular thinking about applying virtue ethics, and how we're going to be starting with this question of what's a good moral character to have? What kind of person do I want to be? Versus asking these questions like we've been asking with the previous ethical theories we've looked at, centering around what kinds of action, like what should I do? What kinds of actions are good actions, right? So now that we've talked about that point, we're going to move on to something that I mentioned just a little bit earlier, about these different versions of virtue ethics, and in particular, how each version sort of has a different approach for hanging specific virtues together, right? So within these different versions, right, we find that within these different versions, what we're going to find are specific virtues that are considered the most important. Like I asked on the quiz, you know, for all of you to just list off some virtues that you just, whatever came to mind or whatever. And from there, sort of what characterizes a version of virtue ethics is that there's certain traits that sort of work at the core of that approach within that version of virtue ethics. There's going to be some virtues that are going to be more important to develop within oneself than others. And within that, to some extent, there will be an explanation as to why those traits are most important. So I had asked, on the quiz, how do you think any of the virtues that you listed off are related? And then additionally, I asked, are there any of the virtues on your list that are like top priority kinds of virtues? So the way that it's going to work within these different approaches that we're looking at is we'll have certain virtues that really are at the core of what it is to be a good person, like the number 1, 2, 3, maybe things to strive towards that are really going to be the important part of developing that good moral character. All right. Does anybody have any questions about what I just said? Or maybe would you like me to explain it in a slightly different way than how I just explained it? Okay, we're doing all right, wonderful. Okay. All right, so the first version we're going to be looking at is Aristotle's version of virtue ethics. Now, it was mentioned in the textbook, Aristotle was Plato's student, right? So I think that, one thing that I did notice, I think all of us, including myself, struggled with when we were looking at Meno is like, all right, we can understand all the reasons why Socrates didn't agree with Meno or had all the issues that that Socrates pointed out in Meno's argument. And so we get why, his answer to what virtue is wasn't a very good answer. But, and this is something that I heard from a lot of people, there's a little bit of like, oh, well, then how in the heck do you sort of define this thing? Like, what is virtue then? And I don't think it should come as any surprise that the person who is sort of like followed Plato, who wrote Meno, right? Like we talked about, the person who wrote Meno. It's not any surprise that like they really, this person really took up that question and saying like, okay, like, what is virtue here? And the way that Aristotle began his answer to that question is by looking at what is good for humans in terms of what their function is. Okay. So what does this idea mean? Like, what is like a function of a person, right? So to give some examples, Aristotle talks about flute players, sculptors, artists. He says, just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or any artist, and in general, for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. So it would seem to be for a human if they have a function. So the thinking here is like, all right, so we know what the purpose of a flute player is, right? It's a very simple answer. Would somebody like to take a shot at what it is? Like what the function of a flute player is? Very, very simple. Victoria, I
was just playing the music, an instrument, right?
Yeah, playing the flute, a sculptor, making a sculpture, right?
Yeah.
Any kind of art, like what the thing that they are doing. Really, like the way we can think about this is the essential activity, identifying an essential activity to a thing. Okay. And then from there, what we want to do is say, all right, well, what is it to be that thing or to do that thing well? So again, this is going to be a really simple answer. So what if the purpose of being a flute player is to play the flute, what would somebody need to do to be good at their function? What would a flute player need to do?
Practice, keep on practicing,
And it's even more simple than that.
playing.
Playing what? Playing what? Like
Playing the flute.
playing it well, right? Like playing beautiful music. Yeah. Knowing, not just knowing how to play the flute, but playing it really well. I mean, I think, I don't know, perhaps there are some people here that are sort of like well-versed in various kinds of music that are in a specific kind of music where there's flute playing involved. This is not something that necessarily I'm super familiar with, but I mean, I think we can really any kind, like pick your favorite artist, whether it's like music or visual art. It could even be like performance art. I mean, honestly, like it could be like a good comedian, whatever, right? And you can sort of you can fill in the blanks. Like, okay, a comedian, the purpose of being a comedian is to stand-up comedian, right? Is to do stand-up comedy. And then to be a good stand-up comedian, you have to do good stand-up comedy. Let's see, I think I had a hand up. Was that Victoria?
Yes, I was thinking about like in terms of mastery, right?
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. When we think of like people who are the masters. So when, pick your whatever magazine or something like this, like the top 100 artists of all times or whatever, like the people in that top 10, really, it's not, they don't just know how to do like sing or something like this, right? Like they've like developed the mastery of this skill. And it's not necessarily a simple thing, right? Like it's not just knowing how to go through the motions and hit certain notes and that sort of thing. Like there's a lot. I think that, focusing on art is a really good way for us to start into thinking about what Aristotle has in mind here, because really, developing those skills of say what it is to be a really good, like musical artist, singer, songwriter, somebody who's a combination of those things, right? There's a lot involved with that kind of skill. You're not going to just say that Beyonce, say if you like Beyonce, or if like the reason why you think that she's like this really important artist is because she's good at singing and like writing songs and performing, right? Like you're gonna have a richer explanation than that. There's going to be more involved in order for her to reach this level of mastery. And yes, Victoria's mentioned this, and yeah, Kaden mentioned it before. I think that there was maybe one other person who brought this up, and there's definitely a very important aspect of discipline that we are going to talk about. We're going to be talking about while we're looking at this slide. Okay, so the purpose of a human's purpose. So setting aside like the stuff about like artists specifically, but just humans in general, the purpose of humans in general, Aristotle argued is that we are rational animals. We have this capacity to reason that, importantly, I wanted to know, is much different than what Kant had in mind, right? For Kant, it was like we could sort of go through these steps in an argument and draw conclusions that anybody with those kinds of rational capacities, if used properly, would draw those conclusions as well. So like if you were thinking sort of, moving through the argument in the right way, thinking through your reasons in the right kind of way, this way that we're just naturally capable of thinking through things, then everybody would come to these conclusions specifically about, what is right and what is what kinds of actions are good actions and what kind of actions are wrong. So that kind of moving through and thinking through reasons, to some extent, I'm not going to say that Aristotle was completely unconcerned with that, but his concept was very, very different. Specifically because this rational capacity that humans have is focused for him on this idea of like a capacity to self-regulate. For anyone that maybe like poked around on the internet, I think there was like maybe a couple of sentences in the textbook about other concepts or sort of like other applications of, or rather other ways that Aristotle applied this notion of rational. Like he had kind of different ideas of it that apply differently in different contexts. But when we're talking about his virtue ethic specifically, this rational capacity is one that centers around the idea that we are capable of self-regulation. And this sort of purpose, like rationality is the thing that allows us to self-regulate, and specifically, we are right. This was the quote. I wrote down a quote because I think that this is a really, this was something that came in the block of text that you read by Aristotle. So this capacity for self-regulation, like this purpose of our, or rather, this capacity to reason, and this capacity to use reason to self-regulate, is like a process where we're bringing the complex self into order as it unfolds. Okay. So it's like, as we're sort of experiencing all these different things in the world, and changing and developing as humans and all of that, reason is the thing that allows us to bring these complex, growing, developing parts of ourselves into order. So I know that maybe this sentence doesn't sound like something that that maybe somebody would write today, but I do think it's like a nice, concise way to understand what he's talking about when he's talking about the purpose or the function of humans as it relates to this capacity, this rational ability that we have. So as we'll let's see, would anybody like me to explain that in a slightly different way, or does anybody have any questions about what Aristotle understood the function of humans to be?
Could you I'm so sorry. Could you explain it again?
Oh, I apologize. No, that's great. Yeah. Okay. So, and it's a little, I think that we're going to see really shortly. It's a little bit easier to understand when we see it in practice. But the basic idea is that we are rational in the sense that we are capable of self-regulating. And like, as we're moving through the world and changing and developing and all of these, we're trying to like, do these different things in our life, all of this stuff, we're capable of taking all of these changes and developments within ourselves and bringing them into order, sort of creating a harmony, an internal harmony within ourselves, like making it work. We're really good at making all this stuff that happens inside as we like grow and change, making it all work and fit together. Like we're going to talk about shortly, this is very much what is going to, this capacity to like make the chaos work, I guess you could think about it that way, is going to be really important for developing a good moral character. Caden, does that help a little bit more? Yep. Okay, yeah, great. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So when we get really good at that balancing, act, we reach this point of what Aristotle called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. Yeah, I feel like this is always a word that everybody struggles with. I still struggle with it. And there's definitely different ways people pronounce it. So, if you end up writing about this during the class activity later today, or like if you're like talking about it, or if you're like asking me a question at any point, you can just call it human flourishing. The word doesn't directly translate to that. It's a little bit more complicated, but for our purposes here, since purpose was also obviously something very important to Aristotle, right? We can just think about it as this notion of human flourishing. So this is why I actually spent not a bunch of time, but a fair amount of time trying to find like the perfect image to capture the idea of what Aristotle had in mind here. So like really like living up to our full potential, just like that, if the purpose of our brains was to be a beautiful garden, this is the visual goal for like reaching this point of like really like being very skilled at like balancing the chaos, right? And the only way to reach this state of human flourishing is going to be by developing a good moral character. It's very much like at the heart of this idea that, like what it is to be a good character, or what it is to have a good character, is somebody who is really, really good at finding balance. What does that mean? I think that the graph captures it pretty well. So Aristotle talks about this thing called the golden mean, which essentially is finding the middle ground between two extremes, between two extremes of an emotion or action. So what Aristotle thought is we could really characterize any we could take for any character trait, you would find essentially three parts. You would find an extreme version of that character trait, in terms of deficiency, like not enough of it. And you would find a version of it that is like way too much, like extra, right? So the person who is really good at self-regulating, i.e. performing the function of being a human, is somebody who is really good at finding the middle path, finding the golden mean. All right, so here are some examples I have up, right? So one of the ones that was talked about actually in the textbook, we have this one here. See, oh yeah, I didn't, this is a screen grab. Courage. So when we think about being a courageous person, what that involves, or so rather somebody who is a courageous person, means they're not going to run away and be scared. They're not going to be a coward. And importantly, they're not going to be reckless either. Okay. So I think, like, personally, one of my favorite examples of this, like, I think we have a pretty clear idea of like what cowardice looks like. Okay. Does anybody have an example that immediately comes to mind? Like maybe from a TV show or movie or something like this? Like an example of somebody being a coward? A cowardly dog? I don't know.
I have an example.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
from my favorite show, Friends.
Oh,
So
okay.
one of the characters, Joey, he's known to avoid all sorts of confrontation at all time. So there's one episode his grandma came to visit him to watch his show on, I think it was in a show there, and they cut him So
Oh.
he didn't know how to explain to her that he got cut. So he said, "Oh, I know what I'm gonna do," and then runs out the runs out the room, even though his friends told him, like, "Please don't do that thing where you run out and then don't tell us." And then he goes, "Okay, I won't." Ooh,
Yeah,
an idea, and then runs out again. It was like kind of funny.
yeah. I think this is such a classic one where like the person makes a mess and then they run away, sort of thing, right? Like you're just like, can you please just like
Yeah,
take it a little bit, like be uncomfortable for 2 seconds instead of running away. I think that's a really common like comedy bit that we see. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a really familiar kind of cowardice. And then I think, like a more like cartoony version is something that we see like in The Wizard of Oz with the Cowardly Lion, where he's like something scary happens and he's like hiding behind a tree, right? Okay, so I think we got the idea of cowardice wrong. All right, so what's on the opposite end of the spectrum? We have recklessness. And my favorite example of that, and I'm happy to hear other people's examples as well, but I feel like, any kind of action movie, definitely this happens all of the time in Marvel movies. I know that there's quite a few people here that like that know quite a bit about Marvel movies, where you have these people that are like parents, right? That are just like insisting on throwing themselves into like risking their lives for strangers, and they're making this claim to like, but this is the honorable thing to do, right? And I feel like even though oftentimes we see that kind of thing valorized on television and in movies and books and stuff like this, I'm always sitting there going, that's so messed up. What about your kid that is relying on you, right? Like, it's all fine and good. You get to do this great moral grandstanding, I guess, of like taking this action that is going to like save a bunch of, or save like a few strangers' lives or something like this, because it's the right thing to do when, you're leaving a kid orphaned or something like this. Yeah. So yeah, that's my favorite example. Does anybody else have an example of recklessness, like the very opposite of cowardice? Yeah, Ray.
I was gonna use the Marvel examples as well, like the superhero movies. They
Mhm.
you ever noticed how when they're trying to save the whole city, they actually end up demolishing half of the city on their way to saving everybody?
Yeah.
So it's like, to me, it's like you did all this to save one person, but what about all those buildings and people that had lives, kids, pets inside there, and you're just
How
breaking
I
it
think
down
about
like
I think about that
Like
too.
the Flash.
and it's like, who's gonna pay
That's
for all that
different.
reconstruction afterwards too? Like, you really gotta think about that. Like, y'all don't pay for it. Y'all don't get paid to be a superhero. So who gonna fix this?
Yeah. I think about that a lot. Does anybody else have any other examples, or was like wanted to like add to something about like the Marvel example? No. You'll have opportunities to think about it maybe a little bit more later. Oh, Zaquana, so you said something about drinking and driving. Were you talking about courage, or maybe was that the example, or did you have something slightly different in mind? Oh, okay. Oh, you were talking about cowardice. I see. Yeah. So yeah, so this, I mean, I think that this, when we think, especially when we think about something.
I'm sorry, Professor. My computer is like dying. It's like my internet is not good at all. That's why I'm just chatting. But I was talking about the part with driving. Like, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
You cut out a little bit, I think. What was it?
I'm going to type it in the chat because my internet is not.
Oh,
So I'm going to type it.
okay. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, yeah, type it. That sounds great. But yeah, I mean, I think that especially when we look at something like courage, what Aristotle is saying here about, all character traits feels very intuitive. It feels very familiar, right? And I mean, I think like something that I feel we see, I know I I look at Twitter. I think that that this probably comes up on a lot of different social media platforms, but I see a lot of conversations about finding that middle ground between being a super selfish person in relationships and being somebody who just gives it all, right? Like oftentimes we say that, like, you know, when there's two people that just like give it all in relationships, oftentimes those kinds of relationships are described as codependent, right? Like you're just like have, you know, like enabling somebody's sort of worser tendencies, really just like completely losing sight of yourself and just always putting the other person first. And I feel in a lot of these discussions, sometimes not always, but there's some kind of word like love, finding that balance between those two things, between those two extremes, right? So that's another place where you know, sort of spelling things out on this as this spectrum feels somewhat familiar. And you could probably go through I think I chose this image in particular because I think these are the ones here that feel really, really familiar. Also, I think importantly, very importantly in our day and age, this isn't one that obviously Aristotle came up with, but this balance between being a workaholic, right? And like not doing anything, right? Finding like some good middle ground where, you know, I as somebody that worked in restaurants for a really long time, I admired the people that could just come into work, kill it at their job, and then leave and go on with their life, right? Really like when work is done, work is done. None of the drama or intense stuff that happened just kind of like melted off their shoulders. And then they were able to leave, go home, regenerate, maybe like do stuff, because everybody who works in restaurants in New York has another job too, go to their other job, something else, like really get a lot of fulfillment from that, and then come back refreshed and ready to just focus on the job. Once the shift is done, then you leave, right? That's somebody that's like really good at finding that balance. Like Denise says, yeah, don't take it with you, right? Those things that happen, not holding on to it, not just being really obsessed and focused. And that might be related to some kind of drama, or, you know, especially outside the restaurant industry, if you have a job that you can literally take home with you, right? Like if you like real estate agent work, right, where you can like, you're like responding to like people that are contacting you all the time and things like this, you know, never really getting off of your phone, just always being there instead of going home, closing the door and not taking it with you. That kind of middle ground, being diligent with your work as opposed to like a workaholic or not doing anything at all. Okay, so this is so I was probably talking before a little bit about, you know, this idea of the, you know, this rational function of humans Aristotle talked about, and how it's all about self-regulation. And I knew that was a little abstract and a little bit like, oh, wait, what is this? Sure, there's some people that I know, there's at least like some people that were confused about it. So then when we sort of see it in practice, what it looks like about finding this nice balance, this middle path between two extremes in terms of an emotion or some kind of action, we have a much better idea of what Aristotle was talking about in terms of what the purpose, the function of a human is. Okay, so this is something that, you know, the traits on this list are, I think there's two that Aristotle talked about. The other ones are a little bit more modern. And part of the reason why that kind of information is filled out is because people have picked up this idea that Aristotle had and applied it in a slightly different way. So not necessarily buying into the stuff about like what the purpose of a human is, but saying, okay, wait, I think Aristotle's onto something when he's talking about like, let's look at the purpose of something, let's not maybe go full human like in general about everyone, but just thinking about the purpose of something and then looking at that purpose, really analyzing it in order to determine what counts as doing that thing well and what counts as doing that thing poorly. Kind of like we were talking about in the very beginning about flute players and sculptors and artists and things like this. It was a little bit, it wasn't a whole lot just like, well, you know, it's being good at playing the flute, or like it's having a certain kind of like ability to really like get to people's hearts using your voice or something like this. But we didn't really spell it out in full detail the way that Alistair McIntyre spells it out. With starting with this, like, yeah, okay, let's think about the purpose of something, some role, some profession, and then looking based off of that, thinking about, all right, so what counts as like being good or bad at that thing? And if we go through kind of systematically, especially looking at different jobs, different professions, we could pretty quickly figure out what counts as a virtuous doctor or lawyer, or journalist. Okay. So the way that McIntyre describes like his sort of application of some of Aristotle's thinking is that we can think of virtues as an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to the practices, and the lack of which effectively prevents us from achieving any such good. All right, so like what undermines doctoring, what undermines lawyering, what undermines journalisming, right? And you know, what is it to really be a good doctor, a good lawyer, a good journalist, and so on. That's how we can identify these different professional virtues. So importantly, this isn't going to necessarily be giving us a whole lot on virtue ethics more broadly. It's a very specific, more modern application of Aristotle's, of some aspects of Aristotle's virtue ethics. But it is, I think, something that is, you know, I've seen it in a lot of students. I've seen it in a lot of students here and some of the stuff we've talked about. In particular, some of that positive reaction that I saw to the point that way back when Mina was making about there being virtues associated with different roles that people played. Remember, I think there were like quite a few of you that were like, you know, obviously we're not going to really care about what virtuous behavior looks like for somebody who's been enslaved, or like we don't think about the roles of women in that way anymore, right? But we talked about other kinds of roles where we're like, oh, okay, yeah, if you like think about the purpose of that role, there are some maybe some like certain moral obligations that are associated specifically with that role. And what McIntyre is doing here is kind of giving a theory as to why that's the case, or making an argument as to why that's the case. So if we think about the purpose of what it is to, say, be a teacher, from there we can pull out certain virtues, certain virtuous characteristics that we would hope a teacher would have. So does anybody have any questions about maybe the difference between what McIntyre is talking about here and Aristotle's theory? Yeah, Victoria.
It's not a question, but McIntyre's thinking is on how, like, the code of conduct, you know, doctors have a code of conduct, how to practice. Teachers have the same. So that is what McIntyre is leaning towards.
Well, what he's doing there is he's saying, like, look, we already have people kind of thinking in this way about stuff. And if we identify from these kinds of, like the Hippocratic Oath, for example, if we can identify, you know, or rather within that, we see a relationship between the oath that doctors are making, the things that doctors are committing to do, and the internal good of those practices. There is a purpose. There's a reason why we have doctors making those oaths, right? Like not to cause any harm under no circumstances, right? Because the purpose is to help people. And sort of analyzing that connection a little bit more, like diving deeper, saying like, okay, from here, actually, we can pull out virtuous character traits. Like maybe the Hippocratic Oath doesn't explicitly say like, here are the virtuous character traits that doctors should have. But when we see it in this light, using a little bit of Aristotle here, we can identify some virtuous character traits for doctors. It kind of adds a little bit more weight to the promises that maybe like a doctor is making when they take the Hippocratic Oath. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I just thought about saying that a doctor should be should show empathy.
I mean, yeah, I went back and forth on how much I was going to dive in because I think that on paper, the doctor example is a good way to sort of spell out the thinking in McIntyre's view here. But yeah, out of curiosity, in the chat box, this could be either your own experience or experience of somebody you know. Have you either directly or indirectly, yes or no, experienced a not very empathetic doctor? Yes or no in the chat box, everybody. Right? Yeah. It's a huge problem. It's a massive problem. There are so many problems. And I mean, in fact, there's like, and there's, yeah, one there, I have had a very specific back and forth with one student in this class. I won't like make her talk about it if I don't want to like force her into like going into detail about anything. It wasn't personal, but just like making these observations specifically about, yeah, like this is a thing that doctors actually seem to be not so good at. And it's not necessarily something that the Hippocratic Oath gets us to. And I think it's problematic that I think a lot of doctors find ways to really see the purpose of their profession as being one where empathy isn't super crucial. And yeah, like we're going to talk about a little bit later, the space for self-criticism and being wrong and things like this, like really like, is this actually a virtue? That sort of thing within virtue ethics more generally is a little bit of a problem. Sorry, Victoria. So I did a little bit of a tangent there. Did you have another point that you wanted to make about empathy and doctors?
No, No, I understand I understand. It makes sense.
Were you
like I was thinking that even though they have a code of conduct, but we're just talking about empathy. We know that they know they're supposed to save life, but sometimes they don't even think about those little things like we just mentioned here. As a doctor, I think that you are supposed to be empathetic. You have to. Patients are coming in with all kinds of problems, and you have to find a way to alleviate probably their pain or whatever they are going through. But most of the time, some of these doctors, they are not even thinking, they are not even looking at you, they are not even paying attention. But I don't believe that.
I mean, or they're deciding that you don't know what you're talking about. They're blowing you.
They just blow you off. Like you don't even know you don't understand what is happening to your own body.
Yeah.
I came to you for a reason. I know what is happening to me. I need answers. That's why I came to you.
Yeah. And I think you're bringing up a really important point here. And it's the thing that I touched on in the end. And I think that was where you were really starting from, is that if we're just looking at the Hippocratic Oath and we're trying to like pull out some of the virtuous characteristics for being a doctor, or just thinking about what the purpose of being a doctor is, like there does seem to be a lot of space to ignore the importance of doing the things that you're talking about. They've come up with ways to rationalize not in Aristotle's sense, not really in Kant's either, but, you know, a more common colloquial sense of the term, like rationalize, like behaving in some pretty, treating patients not so great always. Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Victoria?
Oh, no, I'm okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a really wonderful point. And I would like us to talk about this at the end when we talk about some of the challenges for virtue ethics. Lisa, yeah, you had a question or comment?
Yes. To add to Victoria's point here, I see where she was going, but one thing that I wanted to mention was if a doctor is heavily credentialed and at the top of his field, because I've experienced this, they can be very rude because they think who they are. And they think that, you know what, if you want a better doctor, you can't find anyone that's better than me. So, you know, that's another way where a doctor can yes, definitely egocentric, because I experienced that. I had a doctor I had to wait 3 hours for, and he yelled at each of his patients, like yelled. And everyone was just taking on like the verbal abuse because he was so good.
To some extent, in certain ways. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a really serious question here. I think that this is, again, yeah, I am so glad, because I actually didn't think through the challenge that we're going to talk about a little bit later and this particular issue with doctors. And I appreciate everybody like really bringing this out here. We're going to see that, you know, the space for criticism and some of the kinds of reflection that, you know, we've been really focusing on doing in this class. It's not a whole lot. It can be hard to figure out, not impossible, but it's a limitation. It's a real challenge. If all you're going to do is go with the virtue ethics part, right? Then you have some hard questions to answer. It's like, you're going to say like, I am a virtue ethicist. So this is part of who I am. And this is how I decide, you know, like what it is to be a good person and a bad person. And that's morality. End of story. Like, this is it. There's some pretty serious questions that you need to answer. Like, okay, well, you know, like, how do you prioritize different virtues? And what happens if something you think is virtuous, like, isn't actually virtuous? How do you give answers to that? How do you explain, how do you justify these conflicts or these priorities? And yeah, Shanili, thank you for bringing this up about the way we are talking about virtue now is very much specific to the way that MacIntyre has it in mind here. And I'm glad that you reiterated, you know, like Aristotle, there's definitely a lot of overlap with Aristotle here, but like I said, MacIntyre took aspects of what he was talking about to develop or examine sort of what virtue ethics within specific professions might look like, identifying virtuous behavior based on a profession. And I do think that this is a very, you know, when we get the, you know, anybody who like starts a new job that's at all like a corporate job, right? I think probably a lot of people have had that, where like there's like a mission statement or something like this by the company, and specifically in relation to like the kind of like ethos that the company cultivates within its employees. And like, there's always a little bit about, yeah, like hardworking, depending on the job, maybe like some attention to detail. And like, if it's a customer service, like kindness and compassion and these sorts of things, right? Like those kind of, ostensibly are something that are those, you know, advocating for those traits to be developed within employees is ostensibly tied up in the idea of like what the purpose, what the mission of the company is. So we definitely see this kind of thinking still here today. But yeah, again, what Shanili said is absolutely right. Like the idea of virtue that, or virtuous character traits that Aristotle was talking about doesn't entirely match up to what we're talking about here. Okay. So we're going to move on to a couple of different versions or rather two other versions of virtue ethics. But before we do, I just want to check to see, does anybody have any questions that they wanted to like kind of lingering, you know, like, oh, I was actually feeling confused about this part of what you were saying about Aristotle. If you wanted to speak up now, you're welcome to. or anything you want me to explain maybe a little differently? Okay. Well, if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me about it or talk with me a little bit after class. Okay, so we've been focusing on what typically gets called the West, right? Aristotle's like Western thought kind of thing. And so now we're going to be looking at two different versions of virtue ethics that come from the East. The first one we're going to be looking at is Confucius' version of virtue ethics. So there the idea, actually, I believe that I completely forgot to double check the timeline. But I should have. It's one of those things that I know. I'll update. I'll post on Blackboard to give you a sense. I believe that Confucius is roughly around maybe a little bit later than Aristotle, but I'll need to double check that. I apologize. But we're talking a very, very long time ago is the main point that I think that we need to understand to move forward. So yeah, just to give you a sense of the timeline here. I apologize for not making that explicit. But yeah, so long time ago, we have a very different version of virtue ethics, definitely centered around the idea of human flourishing. But like I kind of mentioned in the beginning, when I was talking about how we're going to be discussing different versions, there's this idea of individual virtue, like individual flourishing, which we talked about with Aristotle. And then there's like community flourishing, like relationship flourishing, humanity more on the whole flourishing. And that's the kind of flourishing, that living up to the full potential that Confucius was most concerned by. Specifically, he was living during a time where there was a lot of like war and upheaval, political instability, violence happening in China. And so it's been argued, and I think that there's some plausibility to this, that, or rather, he actually has like talked about this, where, seeing all this violence, seeing all of these extreme bad behaviors, the way people were treating one another, really affected him so strongly. It was like so appalling that sort of in response to that, it was like arose this thinking of like, wow, we are going to the absolute extreme with the worst ways for humans to behave, like a low of the lowest in humanity. So what's the thing in the opposite direction? It's having reverence for relationship and community, and a very much like coming together with people in various ways, right? So it begins, or rather the most important virtue for Confucius was humaneness. So being humane to one another, and or we could also understand that as like a kind of benevolence, just like a well regard for fellow humans. And that's very general and that's very broad. And the way for Confucius that it was realized, or this kind of virtue was realized, was in direct relation to our relationships. So it starts by looking around and looking at the relationships that we find ourselves in, and thinking about the kind of requirements or the expectations on behavior that arise from those relationships. And ultimately, if we're on this, you have somebody who is being a good child, a good parent, a good neighbor, a good citizen, a good worker, all of those things, like in also, right, we have a cluster of a bunch of different kinds of relationships for just one person. If in all of those relationships, that person is living up to the expectations or the requirements for having good relationships in all of those different ways, if everybody is doing that, what we end up having is a harmonious society. So living in harmony with one another, that's sort of like the pinnacle. That's the human flourishing, that's society, community on the whole, right? Like the flourishing bit. So we want to strive towards being humane or being benevolent in our individual relationships in order to get to that place. And like I said, that's going to involve different sorts of behaviors depending, because we have different expectations in different relationships, right? Like the kinds of expectations and requirements that a person has for being like a good parent or being like a good caretaker to like a kid. Those kinds of requirements and expectations are going to look a lot different than the kinds of requirements and expectations of a child to its parent, right? Like there's like different, essentially there's like different virtuous character traits that we can identify on each side of the relationship. It's not going to be something that goes the same both ways, right? Like for Aristotle, to some extent, I mean, kids can't be virtuous for Aristotle, but, or they can like, they start the process, the education bit. But there are like, if you have like a grown kid with their parent, and there's going to be on both sides of that relationship for Aristotle, like courage is going to look the same. Temperance is going to look the same, that sort of thing. Whereas for Confucius, it's going to look significantly different. Like filial piety was like very important. So, like really, I think that when we were talking in the very beginning of this class about like what the word respect means, and I think quite a few people brought up like respecting your elders. I remember seeing that example a lot to explain the concept. That's very much something that Confucius was concerned about. So it's like what that looks like, giving that kind of respect, and then what needs to happen in return in order for this to be a good, harmonious relationship. Those virtues are going to be significantly different. And I'm trying to think if there was anything else that we needed. Right. So another important thing to keep in mind with Confucius is, like I mentioned, this idea of respect is the one about like respecting your elders. Like that's something that's familiar. But also the kinds of obligations or expectations or requirements that somebody needs to meet in order to have a good relationship with the state. Like those things are going to be very specific too. In particular, sort of different virtues ascribed to being a civil servant, right? Like being being someone like a social worker, I guess, in our times, or working even at the DMV, something like this, like working for the state and working for the government, like dedicating your life to like doing that, maintaining that kind of support. That was actually that kind of civil service. I mean, obviously not the DMV, but, different occupations like that. Those were held in very high regard in China, a little bit following Confucius. It took a minute for the wars to settle down and his ideas to take hold. But that kind of reverence for people who occupied those positions is something that ended up like really influencing a lot of the European attitudes towards civil service, like towards, like people that are dedicating their lives working for the government, keeping it functioning, that sort of thing. So Yeah, I think the main thing to keep in mind here is just as we would understand Confucius's views today, really thinking a lot about what the different kinds of expectations on each side of a relationship are, and then finding that balancing act in all of the different relationships. And that ultimately aiming towards this goal of like ultimate harmony through society. So again, contrast to Aristotle, who is all about the human flourishing, finding the balance in the midst of the chaos within the person, right? That was like, you could do that. You could be a virtuous person and live in a society where there was a lot, you could exist as a virtuous person amidst many, many not virtuous people. Whereas, being a virtuous person for Confucius, like really required a lot of consistency, like across the board, because in order to educate and become a virtuous person, like that requires teaching. For Aristotle, it required teaching, most definitely, but you could just find one moral exemplar, like one shining example, like perfect, and go to that, just try to mimic that person. Maybe if you're really lucky, you can like talk to that person. Like you just need that one person, like they can give that to you. You can like learn how to like be the flourishing, finding balance in the midst of the chaos, like really good at finding the golden mean type of individual. Whereas for Confucius, this was something that was like, it takes a village. I think this was a quote that was from the textbook. It takes a village. Like you need education in terms of all of these different relationships, really to help ensure that it's really hard to be a virtuous island in the midst of a sea of not virtue for Confucius's view. So did anybody have any questions about that part, or would you like me to explain any part of it a little bit different? Oh, thank you, Victoria. That's really, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it was yeah. So yeah, it was between 551 and 479 BC. Yeah. Thank you. And I'll give a more clear timeline of like the different these different views. But yeah, we're talking long time ago, as in thousands of years ago, including the next view or the next version of virtue ethics that we're going to be looking at, which. So the book put the Buddhist and the Taoist version together, like treated it really as the same version. And that is definitely right. In terms of both Buddhist versions of virtue ethics and Taoist versions of virtue ethics are about removing this barrier between the self and the other. So this image that I have here, I actually took a minute and I designed it myself. Like it's one of those line drawings that doesn't ever, it's just like one continuous line. And that's really capturing the thing that these two very different practices to some extent have in common. I did just want to quickly point out, because the book didn't mention it, but Buddhism is not a religion and Taoism is. So if that's something that anybody is curious about, like the differences between those two things, I'd be happy to send some resources your way. But I did want to emphasize that, these are actually two, they have certain ideologies or principles or approaches in common. There's like some core stuff that they have in common. But again, like there is like a higher power, and to some extent, not one that you worship, but there exists a higher power within Taoism, whereas there does not within Buddhism. Still though, the aim for both is to the sort of like, if we want to think about this in terms of like, or I guess it's actually not necessarily good to think about it in terms of purpose and function, but rather if we want to think about the principle that hangs all the virtues together, for both Buddhist versions of virtue ethics and the Taoist version of virtue ethics, it all hangs together at the aim. So it's not necessarily our purpose, but like our goal. We have sort of this inherent life goal to remove the barrier between ourself, so like where our like skin and mind and all that stuff stops and like the other world begins, to really like shed that and remove it, get it away. Now the satisfaction of that goal for Buddhism is much different than Taoism. Like that's within Taoism, like that's kind of when you like die and elevate, like you like belong to this like higher, you exist in this like higher space. There's a hierarchy there. Within Buddhism, like it's a little bit more complicated. Again, anybody who wants to ask me, get some resources for learning more about that distinction, you're welcome to send me an email. But from that aim, that purpose, just like that moving in that direction, that route, we can pull out and identify, or rather like based on that route, we can pull out and identify different virtues. So within Buddhism, and this is definitely true of Taoism, although it's like framed in a slightly different way, as you saw in the poem that you read at the end of the chapter, there's a major emphasis on letting go of attachments. So is anybody familiar with this idea of letting go of attachments?
Is it like letting go of anything that that does not feel right, like anger?
Anger is a sign that you're attached to something.
You're attached to. Oh, it's not coming. I had it right here. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's completely fine. I mean, I think it's something that like a lot of us are very familiar with. Oh, Jose, do you want to explain that a little bit more? Do you want to explain the Star Wars thing a little bit more? I can't remember. Maybe if your mic isn't. So Jose brought up Star Wars. And that is that, I mean, that's like, yeah. So Jedis are not supposed to have emotional attachments. So, you know, George Lucas is a funny man. He's definitely like, I don't know how many people are sort of like familiar with the, I guess like probably this age group now would be like 60s or 70s. So kind of like hippie era, like white guy, learns a little bit about different, like especially like Eastern, like religions and things like this. And then just like kind of plops it and being like, oh yeah, you know, like a little bit. Is this kind of personality type familiar to anyone? It doesn't really matter. My point is like he kind of picked a little bit out of Buddhism without really knowing a whole bunch, and then put it in this this framing of like, well, the Jedis are like kind of, they're supposed to be like a Buddhist kind of warrior, where they really, you know, in order to really be in line with the Force and not go to the evil side, they can't have any, they have to let go of all of their emotional attachments. There's a lot of ways, I just wanted to flag it, that that's not consistent with Buddhism. However, the thing that happens both for Luke and for Darth Vader and like other characters, but I think that hopefully everybody's familiar enough with these things. They get angry. Like Luke gets angry, and for those of you who haven't seen it, Luke gets angry because or rather, Darth Vader got angry. The reason why he turned into Darth Vader, like this really, he started off as like in line with the Force, like this very like amazing, wonderful Jedi. And then like he devolves into Darth Vader, this like ultimate villain. And the reason why he devolves into it is because he was very angry that his mother was killed. Like he let his anger and his grief over his mother's death affect him so horribly that, and he had all of this power because he was very like good at using the Force. And it was twisted by another evil character and used to get him to turn into like the ultimate villain. And that kind of like anger taking over and that sort of thing. And I think that, you know, even if you're not familiar with Star Wars, you're probably very familiar with the idea of people getting angry at maybe being considered a stage in grief when they lose someone that they love. For within Buddhism, that kind of anger reflects an attachment to life. Like you were attached to not only this person that you loved continuing to live, but also just like this attachment to living instead of being okay with like not staying in like your current corporeal form. So that's like a really extreme attachment to let go. Like really within Buddhism, like that's like the ultimate place that you go. But also when you get angry about not being able to find your house keys, right? Or you get angry because the internet company kept you on the phone for like 5 hours when you have a million other things to do. Oh, so Caden asked this question about Buddha leaving his family. I can, if you want to email me, again, I want to reiterate, if any of this is like interesting, I can like send people just like some like basic stuff about it. But yeah, so I can, if you want to email me about that, Caden, I'm happy to send you something. So yeah, when we're feeling like that kind of like anger about not being able to find something or somebody messing our day up, something not going our way, right? That reflects an attachment to things going a certain way, right? Knowing exactly where your keys are, being able to get all the stuff done that day that you wanted to get done. And so just being able to kind of let go of that, being like, oh, this attachment, like that's considered a virtue, largely because, according to Buddhism, whenever we feel those attachments and we like grip onto it, like grip onto like, no, I need this outcome to happen like this certain kind of way, that, according to Buddhism, is the source of suffering. And not just suffering, but it maintains this barrier between the self and the other. So by letting go of non-attachments in general, that's like that is, you know, tied up in this idea of removing this barrier between the self and the other, and is like, you know, virtue number one is going to be non-attachment there. And part of that process too, removing that barrier, also involves compassion, which is sort of like a mirror, seeing ourselves in other people. It's not something, it's almost like reflexive empathy. So you're like giving empathy out while also receiving it yourself, right? So there's like, when we're thinking, especially, I think like that kind of ideal place between giving too much of yourself in a relationship versus like being too selfish, and that middle ground being love. That idea is very much the idea of like compassion, like finding that kind of middle ground where you're like being good to yourself and being good to another person, like really seeing it from all perspectives. That's like a sort of emotional component to breaking down these barriers. Okay. So yeah, again, I just want to reiterate. So this is a different form of virtue ethics, because instead of starting at like, well, the function of humans is being rational, or all of our relationships are the things that determine, you know, what's good or virtuous behavior. Buddhism starts, and Taoism does to some extent too, at this idea that you know, the purpose is, or the aim here is to remove the barrier between ourselves and the other. And then from there, we find the different kinds of virtue. Does anybody have any questions about what I just said, or maybe another way that you would like me to explain something like compassion or non-attachment? Good. Wonderful. Okay, so then we'll move on to Taoism just really quickly. I did want to touch on it. I feel like the poem at the end of the textbook was a really great sort of way to further draw out a lot of the stuff that I just talked about in connection to Buddhism. So yes, starts with the same aim, but there's a specific way that you go about it. Like it's really open-ended in Buddhism, you know, like how you go about like developing this non-attachment virtue. But within Taoism, the first thing you want to do, and like the poem talked a lot about, you want to look to nature as a guide. So it was talking a lot about water and going with the flow. And really like there wasn't necessarily like there were specific ways to develop non-attachment. It's not, you know, this like big broad theory. It's more like be simple in what you're thinking and being patient, really being able to get hit with all of these different things happening, getting thrown at you, maybe even like different kinds of contradictions and things like this, and just being able to say like, okay, like I'm good. Like I'm just going to keep moving and I'm just going to keep going with it. So it's not necessarily like clearly just letting go and not having attachments. It's like being able to just let things happen. So the route sort of to getting to this place of removing the barrier between oneself and other is by just not experiencing any resistance within yourself, really being able to let that go. And it's from that place that we find or that the certain virtues arise, like simplicity, patience, and compassion. Okay. So now that we've talked about sort of specific versions, essentially what I went through today is roughly 3 different ways that we can hang the like core virtues together. So like I had talked about in this slide in the beginning, like which character traits are important to develop? Why are these traits important? Each version of virtue ethics that we went through could answer both of those questions. And that's sort of what and because they give different answers, right? That's what distinguishes these different versions. However, like I also talked about in the slide immediately before, there is generally something that all of these different versions have in common, namely seeking to be, aiming to be, trying to develop oneself into becoming a good kind of person, developing a good moral character. So whatever your story is for how specific traits hang together, that sort of thing, it's not going to be for each of these versions about, you know, like kind of Caden was talking about in the very beginning, you know, is it okay to lie? Or yeah, I guess it's okay to lie according to virtue ethics, right? Like you don't get specific answers with virtue ethics, depending on which theory you employ, right? Like there's going to be different kinds of behaviors maybe you should emulate, people you should emulate, considering certain relationships that you're in order to determine whether or not under those particular circumstances, it's okay to lie. So we have some differences and we have some similarities. The challenges that we're going to look at now are ones that are challenges largely for all of the versions of virtue ethics that we talked about. Granted, they're going to respond to these different challenges in different ways, but like I had kind of said a little while ago, you know, these are, if you're going to be someone that says, okay, I'm a virtue, like say, I'm an Aristotelian virtue ethicist. This is who I am. That's how I determine right or wrong, blah, 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 you know, or the same like any of the other versions that we touched on. You're going to have to answer each of these questions, and they're difficult questions to answer for any of the versions. So the first challenge that we have for virtue ethics on the whole is that, like Cadence, remember Caden, I was like, remember that question because it's going to come up at the end. The first question is that it's really hard to generalize. Like, she wanted to know, is it okay to lie? No, I'm not talking about a specific circumstance. Like, is it okay to lie? And it's really hard to say, right, in virtue ethics, because things are so particular to individual situations. Now, if you remember, this is also this kind of flexibility, this kind of being particular, like there is something that is refreshing about saying like, well, maybe we don't have an answer to every single moral dilemma that Kant throws at us or something like this. Maybe we don't have like a rule for action at any given moment, like Kant thinks it's really important to do. Or we don't have like a method to calculate what we should do, like utilitarianism taught us to do. Instead, we just have to see what, there's so much variation. Like in general, let's just strive to be a good person, somebody who like makes good judgments about stuff, that sort of thing. And then in those situations, they end up doing the right thing. We just don't know what that is yet. We need the right kind of person in that situation to like figure out what the right thing was to do. So there's some benefit to that, right? Because if you remember, we were talking about the murderer coming and knocking at the door. Does somebody want to remind me what Kant says you're supposed to do when a murderer comes knocking on your door saying like, oh, where's your neighbor? I'm going to kill that person. And you have the neighbor like hiding in your house. What does somebody tell me, what does Kant say you're supposed to do? I know that people know. Well, Caden, not that exactly, but what do you say to them?
Like that you don't know where this.
That's what
I need to tell the truth because you don't want to get in between. Like, yo, like, what if I say the lie? Now he's gonna want to do something to me and the neighbor. So I'm gonna just say.
That's your reasoning, though.
Oh, okay.
That's your reasoning. What did Kant say about lying?
You're not supposed to, no matter what.
You're not supposed to, no matter what. Yeah. And I mean, like, Ray, I think that you were very much on the right track there. Like, it was just, no, like, you don't worry about the consequences. You just don't lie. Because if everybody lied, then the system that we exist within would fall apart. There'd be like nobody would be expecting anybody to tell the truth, A, and B, if we go about this rational, forming these arguments, going through this rational process, everybody comes down on not lying. And because of that, we have this universal rule, this universal law, since that's the one that all our brains, regardless of where we are on the planet, can get us to. That's the thing that you have to do no matter what, no exceptions, right? No exceptions. And I think that, again, like, and we talked about this during the Kant lecture, that is the part that I feel a lot of people, when we were talking about Meno, and a lot of you were discussing about, how I do think there's something to this idea that like, there are these virtues that we can pull out of these different roles that people occupy. I think that, wanting to have that kind of variation, thinking about the circumstances, that sort of thing. Yes, it is very much a benefit to virtue ethics. But kind of like Caden was bringing up in the very beginning, it's not going to give us an answer about whether it's never okay to lie or whether it's always okay to lie. It's always going to depend on the circumstances. And really, depending on what your version of virtue ethics is, like, honesty might not be an across the board virtue, right? Like there might be some situations where it is considered virtuous to not really tell the whole truth to things. Okay. So yeah, so that's the first question. And I think that I've kind of gone through some stuff here as to why, like, yeah, that is a challenge. There are some ways that we can address that. The textbook also talks about how more recently, specifically this philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe has really kind of revived some of Aristotle's virtue ethics and talked about like, no, actually the problem is that we're too heavy on these like hard, fast rules. Like we need this variation, right? So there has been some like robust responses to that challenge. The two other challenges that we're gonna look at are a little bit more serious. So these both specifically relate to Zaquana, that's an excellent question. And I think I actually, would you mind holding on to that? Because I think that is I think it's really interesting to think about how virtue ethics would answer that question. I think I could like add that as like an extra credit on the for like a little extra credit written assignment in the class. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, just for the sake of time, yeah, I'm gonna we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so the last two challenges we're going to talk about are essentially ones that involve looking at situations, whether it be comparing or justifying the existence of certain virtues without, let me try this again. So the second two challenges involve looking at particular circumstances or instances where we're trying to justify, like, this is why we think this thing is a virtue, or saying maybe like this virtue is more important to that than this virtue, right? And situations where we're being critical of a particular virtue. And in both of these cases, in both of these kind of like scenarios or these times that we're asking these questions, it starts to get really hard to not appeal to some further moral principle to justify our responses. So in the case of, and I have, I have my notes down here also for other people to read, like if you can see them. And I spell that, what I just said there, out in a little bit more detail, where like there are instances where we really seem to need some external standards to judge certain things. So, okay, let me be more specific in what I'm saying there, because I'm kind of blurring these two together. So there are instances where we might seriously question whether something is a virtue, right? Like with Aristotle, there are I think this is the textbook talked about this. So part of the Hippocratic Oath, right, contained originally stuff about like it's not okay to sleep with people you've enslaved and things like this, right? And that's a pretty dated concept. I mean, or some of the stuff you can think about in Meno, like some of the like the virtuous behaviors attributed to like being like a good housewife, essentially. Like maybe there's like some places that think that still. And given, we have obviously different virtues, like we've had to, even in this class, like I've had to say like, all right, so that's kind of dated, but we can think about this like in terms of like what it is to be a good EMT or something like this, right? Like we can translate it to a more contemporary setting, but nonetheless, the virtues are different, right? So there becomes this question of like, how do we know that this set of virtues we have are actually virtues? It's all fine and good to say like it comes from, this place of being able to manage the chaos, right? But when it comes to pinning down like specific virtues, because we start to get really specific when we start to talk about things like love or things like temperance, or things like cowardice too, right? And so being able to really draw a clear line between like, well, you know, like that's like, here's like justifying like, well, this is the spectrum. You might have people that are saying like, well, the spectrum might look different, or maybe it's not a spectrum, something like this. Being able to explain the framework without appealing to a further moral principle to help us explain how we know specific virtues are indeed virtues. Doing that without appealing to something else beyond the virtues themselves proves to be a pretty difficult task. And again, I don't want to say that like this is something that is not like virtue ethicists can't answer it, but it is a really important, if you're maybe feeling sort of like, oh, this Aristotle, like this sounds really interesting, I'm going to check this out a little bit more. In checking it out, think about like, all right, so this person, maybe Elizabeth Anscombe, who's arguing for this kind of virtue ethics, like how does she answer this question about how we know what specific virtues are? Because it's a tough question for virtue ethicists to answer, okay? And then relatedly, or rather, so one thing I just wanted to say before moving on from that is, it's not just a matter of finding different sets of virtues, like finding differences between dated sets of virtues and the contemporary virtues that like we have now, but it's very, you know, and we've also talked a lot about this in class, like we see different sets of virtues. There was a little bit, not a whole lot, but a little bit of plausibility to some of the stuff that we were talking about when we were talking about ethically short circuiting. When people make this appeal to relativity, like there is some plausibility to the like, well, we got a bunch of differences, right? And in this context, when we're thinking about all these like different differences, like all of these differences between different sets of virtuous character traits in different societies, right, or different cultures, just in seeing those differences, we want to think about like, okay, well, like, how do you know? Like, what is your system? Now, again, there are ways to answer those issues, but it's something that you want to think about if you're looking at really seriously, like adopting a particular version of virtue ethics. And sort of relatedly, we have like a problem of judging particular. So it's not just justifying our sets of virtues and how we know something is a virtue. We have a really hard time judging certain virtues. Okay, Jose, thanks for letting me know. In particular, when we're thinking about like, if we want to go the McIntyre route and we're thinking about, you know, like what are the internal goods of a job? And we're going to define virtues based on those internal goods. What happens when we have a bad role? What happens when we have a bad job? Do we want to say that doing that job well is virtuous, right? Does anybody remember the example? It was like a pretty strong example in the textbook that was talking about this. Like a kind of like quintessential example of like a bad job that we would want to probably avoid attributing any virtue to doing well. Does anybody remember? So, yeah. So the example is somebody who was working like a Nazi working in a concentration camp, and during the Holocaust, right? So if we say that it's possible to attribute virtue to any profession, right? Like if we think that that's a possibility, then we're kind of stuck in this place of having to ascribe virtues based on how good somebody was at working at a concentration camp, which is a pretty horrific, clearly morally repugnant task to take on or thing to think about, right? Like, and this isn't to say, oh, McIntyre's application of Aristotle's virtue ethics just completely falls apart. But again, it raises the question, well, then what do we have within our framework to really help us do that kind of critical analysis and saying like, this is a morally repugnant job and we shouldn't be attributing any virtue to it, right? We're going to have to give more of a story maybe about how there's virtues that go beyond one's individual profession, but that will need further justification as well. So does anybody have any questions about that last little bit? So yeah, before we finish up the lecture, I just kind of wanted to go back around to something that Victoria and I think Laisa was bringing up in the beginning, a couple other people, just about this issue with being critical of doctors, right? Like this, I think like, and Laisa, I feel like was like this doctor that was like yelling at the patient and things like this idea, like, I know I have this ability to do this thing, to be the best kind of doctor of this kind of doctoring. And this makes me like I have the ultimate virtue in terms of like my ability to like doctor very well, the best, right? So if that's our high priority virtue, then it's hard to maybe see, like if it's just performing a task well, it's hard to see why these other things that we clearly care about, like exercising some compassion in a meaningful, really truly meaningful way, generally just listening, that sort of thing. It's hard to see how we would be able to like, where that like good at doctoring thing connects to the good at listening bit. And there's arguments that you can make for it, but again, there doesn't seem to be like you'd have to appeal to inherent features of each of those virtues to explain the connection. You can't come from any outside principle in trying to draw those things together. Yeah, Denise says a godlike attitude. Yeah, really like. So yeah, I mean, I guess like, how do we? One way to sort of look at this question in terms of the two challenges that we just looked at. How do we know that humility is a virtue for doctors? Additionally, let's say they're on the wrong path. Like, if confidence, because I do think that this is something that is very much like emphasized within like professional medicine, if like confidence is like really like considered to be like the like this super important quality to have, what happens when we want to be maybe critical of that? What happens when we want to say like, no, take that down a little bit? Like maybe what we actually need to prioritize is listening more to people. And yeah, I just want to reiterate, like, there are definitely ways to go about explaining these different things. However, you know, these are really important questions to ask and to get answers to. And we want to be mindful in the process of like, okay, so are you just appealing to the virtues here or inherent qualities of these different virtues to explain a connection, to justify this stuff? Or are you appealing to some kind of outside further moral principle to explain it? Okay. So yeah, you'll get a little bit of practice in thinking some of this stuff through for the group activity that you're going to be working on in just a little bit. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is have us go on about a 5-minute break, get up, stretch, maybe stop staring at the glowing rectangle for a little bit, rest your eyes, and have everybody come back at 10 past 11. And then I'm going to put you into your breakout groups, and you'll have 25 minutes or so to work on the group worksheet that I do have posted on Blackboard, but I'll explain it a little bit. You don't need to spend your break time staring at the screen or anything like this if you don't want to. So yeah, it is available. It's up. You can take a look at it, but I'll explain it. So yeah, I'll see everyone in about 5 minutes. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to stick around and talk with me after.